Few conflicts in Native American history were as brutal or as long-lasting as the war between the Apache and Comanche. Sworn enemies, their struggle was so relentless that the Spanish in Mexico called it a war of extermination. This wasn't just a fight over land, it was a battle for survival. By the late 1500s, the eastern Apache were at their peak. They controlled the southern Great Plains, securing rich buffalo hunting grounds while also maintaining farmlands. This balance of agriculture and hunting gave them both stability and strength, allowing them to thrive. But while the Apache lived in abundance, the Comanche were outcasts. Forced into harsh, unfavorable lands by stronger tribes like the Apache, they developed a culture defined by resilience, aggression, and an unyielding thirst for revenge. Then, in the 1600s, an event set in motion by their greatest enemy would turn the Comanche from scattered outcasts into the most powerful native force in American history. That event, the arrival of the Spanish. By the late 1500s, Spanish conquest in Mexico had fueled a relentless drive northward. They weren't just explorers, they were conquerors, determined to expand their empire. When they reached Apache territory, conflict was inevitable. The Spanish brought steel armor, muskets, and, most importantly, hundreds of horses. By 1600, they had spread into what is now New Mexico, overwhelming local tribes, forcing them into labor and converting them to Christianity under threat of violence. For the Apache, the Spanish were another enemy to fight. But for the Comanche, they were something else entirely. They were the key to their rise. For over 100 years, the Spanish had swept through Central and South America, crushing empires and expanding their reach. But when they pushed north into the lands of the Apache, they met resistance unlike anything they had faced before. The Apache did not submit. They fought. Apache warriors raided Spanish settlements with ruthless efficiency, stealing supplies, taking captives, and most importantly, stealing horses. At first, they watched from a distance, studying how the Spanish rode. But by the 1650s, they had mastered horseback warfare. No longer bound to the ground, they became faster, deadlier, and nearly impossible to catch. Their attacks became relentless, and the Spanish found themselves under siege. Settlements like Taos and Santa Fe were frequent targets. The Pueblo people, whom the Spanish had subjugated, were left to suffer the worst of it. They expected protection from their so-called rulers, but the Spanish could do nothing to stop the raids. Apache warriors would strike in an instant, kill anyone who resisted, and vanish into the vast western landscape, taking hundreds of horses and supplies with them. By 1680, the raids had become so overwhelming that the Pueblo people decided they had had enough, not just of the Apache, but of the Spanish themselves. They rose up in a full-scale rebellion, driving the Spanish completely out of New Mexico. But in their retreat, the Spanish left behind something that would change the course of Native American history forever: thousands of escaped horses. These were Mustangs, built for survival, built for speed, and perfectly suited for life on the Great Plains. And once they roamed free, they didn't stay in one place for long. They spread north. The Spanish had lost their grip on New Mexico. But without knowing it, they had just unleashed the force that would create the most powerful mounted warriors the plains had ever seen. Almost overnight, the Apache raids on Spanish settlements stopped. At first, the Spanish were relieved. But soon, strange reports began to arrive, reports they couldn't explain. Something was happening on the plains, and the Apache were at the center of it. Groups like the Jicarilla and Mescalero Apache were abandoning their homes, leaving their settlements behind, and doing so in a hurry. Entire bands were disappearing from the plains, and no one knew why. The Spanish heard whispers of battles, of something ferocious and unstoppable, but they had no idea who the Apache were fighting. Then the rumors became more alarming. The enemy wasn't just any rival tribe. They were warriors from the north, mounted on horseback. Fast, powerful, relentless. By the 1720s, the devastation was undeniable. Many Apache bands had fled to the mountains, trying to escape the slaughter. Others were so desperate that they turned to the Spanish for protection. Some never made it that far. Spanish expeditions searching the plains found entire Apache groups, like the Pharaohs, Carlones, and Palomas, completely gone. Not defeated, erased, wiped out by a force they couldn't even name. Then the answer came from the Ute. They called the northern invaders Comanche, a name that meant those who are against me all the time, a name the Spanish would soon learn to fear. The Apache had ruled the plains for generations, but now their time was over. The Comanche had arrived. For generations, the Comanche were an afterthought, pushed to the eastern side of the Rockies, struggling to survive in the least desirable lands, while stronger nations, including the Apache, controlled the prime hunting grounds of the Great Plains. They were outcasts, forced to scrape by in a world that had no place for them. But hardship has a way of shaping the future, and the Comanche would never forget what it meant to be powerless. Then, in the mid-1600s, fate delivered them a gift, the very thing that would turn them from a struggling people into the most feared horsemen the continent had ever seen. When the Apache raided Spanish settlements and fought in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, they set loose something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined: the horse. Thousands of Mustangs escaped into the wild, spreading across the plains like wildfire, and every tribe that encountered them quickly learned their value. But while others simply captured and raided for horses, the Comanche did something different. They didn't just ride, they mastered. They didn't just take, they bred. In a world where horses became the new currency of power, the Comanche became rich beyond measure, controlling vast herds that no other tribe could match. While the Apache and other plains tribes still clung to agriculture and settlements, tying themselves to the land and making them easy targets, the Comanche abandoned it all. They became pure nomads, warriors of the open plains, never staying in one place long enough to be caught, never bound by crops or villages that could be burned. With the speed of the Mustang and the cunning of a people who had learned the hard way that survival belonged to those who adapted, they rewrote the rules of warfare on the plains. The same Apache who had once hunted them down now found themselves facing a force that moved faster, struck harder, and disappeared before they could retaliate. In the end, the Apache had unknowingly created their own worst enemy, and the power of the Comanche was only just beginning. Unlike the Apache and other plains tribes who remained tied to the land, the Comanche had no farms, no villages to defend, no fixed settlements to be attacked. They were everywhere and nowhere, a people in constant motion, carried by the power of the horse. With each passing year, their range expanded, and by the height of their dominance, anyone within 400 miles of Comanche territory lived under the shadow of their raids. For the buffalo hunters, this vast range meant survival. For their enemies, it meant terror. The Comanche struck when the land was strongest, spring and summer, when the grass grew tall and their horses were at full strength. But it was at night, under the full moon, that they became truly unstoppable. They rode with the silence of the wind, appearing as shadows in the dark, striking hard and fast before fading back into the endless plains. This pattern became so feared that settlers, soldiers, and even other native nations called it the Comanche Moon, the time when no one was safe. But their greatest weapon wasn't just speed, surprise, or brutality. It was their complete mastery of horseback warfare. While other tribes used horses for mobility, but fought on foot, the Comanche fought entirely from the saddle, a skill that made them almost untouchable in battle. Few outsiders understood this power better than George Catlin, an artist and traveler who witnessed them firsthand. On foot, he described them as unimpressive, but the moment they mounted their horses, they transformed. He called them the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen yet in all my travels. They were not just riding, they were one with their horses. They could loose arrows with deadly precision at full gallop, firing in any direction without breaking stride. They had perfected the art of hanging off the side of their horse, using the animal's body as a shield while firing beneath its neck. No other tribe had mastered this technique to such a deadly degree. In a world where wars were won by the fastest, the most elusive, and the most relentless, the Comanche had become the supreme warriors of the plains. The Apache were fierce, relentless warriors, and on foot they were a match for any enemy. But their mistake was one they never saw coming. They used the horse as a tool for travel, a way to move swiftly, to strike and retreat. But when it came time to fight, they still relied on the ground. The Comanche did not. They lived in the saddle, fought from the saddle, and never let their feet touch the earth in battle. To fight them was to fight an enemy that never stood still, never slept in the same place twice, and never let themselves be found without a horse beneath them. While the Apache held to their way of life, the Comanche adapted to something deadlier. The Apache's strength, rooted in their ability to farm, to sustain themselves, to hold on to land, became their greatest weakness. As historian T.R. Fehrenbach put it, it was this very taste for corn that killed them when their land was invaded by true savages on horseback. The Comanche were not interested in extermination, but they were ruthless in pursuit of what they wanted, and what they wanted was control, not just over land, but over resources, over the lifeblood of the plains, over the buffalo themselves. The raids were swift and brutal. They struck Apache settlements, rancherias, when no one expected them, slaughtering warriors, capturing women and children to be sold into the slave markets of New Mexico, and burning villages to the ground so nothing remained. The Spanish barely understood what they were witnessing, recording only glimpses of a war that unfolded in the shadows of history. A war so devastating that by the time it was over, there was not a single Comanche left who did not see the Apache as an enemy. The Lipan Apache were among the last to hold on to the plains, but even they could not withstand the storm. By the 1720s, the Mescalero and Jicarilla Apache had already retreated into the mountains, but in 1723, a final, mysterious battle was fought, El Gran Sierra del Ferrero. What little we know suggests it was a massacre. Comanche warriors swept through the Lipan stronghold, killing untold numbers and capturing so many women and children that entire family lines were erased. With nowhere left to go, the surviving Lipan fled into the deserts and Spanish borderlands, trapped between an unstoppable force to the north and an unforgiving enemy to the south. The war for the plains was over. The Apache were gone. The Comanche had won. By 1749, the Apache were no longer the unstoppable raiders they once were. For decades, they had terrorized the Spanish in San Antonio, striking settlements, stealing thousands of horses, and taking what they needed to survive. But now something had changed. Defeated and driven from their lands by the Comanche, the Apache faced an impossible reality. They could no longer hold the plains, and they had nowhere left to go. So in an unexpected twist, they rode into San Antonio, not as warriors, but as diplomats seeking peace. For the Spanish, it was a moment of relief. Since San Antonio's founding in 1719, Apache raids had been a constant threat, with kidnappings and killings so common that no settler or soldier ever felt safe. But now, the enemy that had plagued them for so long was asking for an alliance. The Spanish, eager to end the conflict and expand their influence, welcomed the idea. What they didn't realize was that the Apache weren't just looking for peace, they were looking for protection. Forced from the rich hunting grounds of the plains into the unforgiving mountains and deserts, they needed allies against a far greater threat, the Comanche. But the Apache's request went even further. They didn't just want a truce, they wanted the Spanish to build a mission and presidio in their lands, offering to convert to Christianity in exchange for military support. This was a stunning shift. For years, the Apache had resisted Spanish rule, refusing to be drawn into their system of missions and forced labor. Now they were willingly asking for one, and the Spanish, seeing an opportunity to not only end Apache raids but also extend their influence, agreed. If they could make the Apache dependent on them, they could pacify an old enemy and perhaps gain something more, because rumors had already begun to spread of gold and silver deposits hidden in Apache territory. The deal was made. A mission would be built at San Saba, financed by a wealthy Spaniard whose only demand was that his brother, Father Alonso Giraldo de Terreros, be placed in charge. The Spanish military would oversee the project under the command of Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla, an experienced officer. On the surface, it seemed like a victory for both sides. Peace for the Spanish, protection for the Apache. But the Apache had unknowingly walked into a dangerous game. The mission they had hoped would be their salvation would soon become a battleground, and the Spanish, believing they had secured an ally, were about to discover just how little they truly understood the war on the plains. In April 1757, the Spanish gathered their supplies, a few priests, 100 soldiers, and about 2,000 animals, and set out for San Saba to establish the mission they had agreed upon with the Apache. But something was wrong from the start. The Apache, the very people who had asked for this mission, were nowhere to be seen. When the Spanish arrived at San Saba, they expected to find Apache waiting, ready to settle. Instead, there was nothing but empty land. Undeterred, the Spanish moved forward. They built both the mission and the Presidio, placing them 2 miles apart and reinforcing them with a large wooden palisade. Still, the Apache did not come. Occasionally, a few would arrive, asking for gifts and assuring the Spanish they would relocate soon. But as the months dragged on and no Apache came to stay, frustration set in. Some priests began to suspect a trick, that the Apache had only wanted gifts, with no real intention of settling. But they were wrong. This was a trick, but not for gifts. By March, the Spanish uncovered the real reason they had been brought here. San Saba was not part of Apacheria, it was Comanche land. The Apache hadn't come looking for protection. They had lured the Spanish right into the heart of their enemy's territory. The deception ran deeper than the Spanish realized. While they labored to build the mission, Apache war parties had been raiding Comanche settlements in the north. But these weren't just ordinary raids. The Apache left behind Spanish tools, Spanish shoes, and other supplies, making sure that when the Comanche discovered their ruined camps, they would believe one thing: the Spanish had sided with the Apache. As March 1758 began, the plains awakened. The spring grasses were growing, and under the clear light of the full moon, the land stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. But something was missing. The Spanish looked around and realized that every Apache around San Saba had vanished. They were gone without a trace, leaving only an uneasy silence behind. At sunrise, that silence was shattered. War cries rang out from beyond the walls, echoing across the open land. The Spanish rushed to secure their horses, only to find that over 60 had already been stolen in the night. The tension grew as a 15-man scouting party rode into the Presidio at full speed, warning that the hills were alive with enemies. But the Comanche didn't strike immediately. For nearly 2 weeks, they remained at a distance, watching, waiting. The Presidio locked down. Most inside refused to leave its walls. Father Alonso Giraldo de Terreros, along with 30 others, remained at the mission, 2 miles away from the Presidio, isolated and vulnerable. Then, on March 16th, the Comanche arrived at the gates of both. What the Spanish saw from behind their palisade left them in awe. At the mission, the Comanche did not charge in. They played a different game. They feigned friendship, and the unsuspecting priests opened the gates, welcoming them inside. The warriors did not come alone. Other native tribes, ones the Spanish had previously worked with peacefully, rode beside them, further easing their suspicions. Once inside, the Spanish tried to appease them with gifts, but the illusion didn't last long. The gathering turned into a massacre. Reports vary, but somewhere between 8 and 10 people, including Father Terreros, were killed. The mission was set ablaze, and the bodies of the dead were mutilated. The Comanche looted what they could, and in the chaos, some survivors fled toward the Presidio. But the warriors did not pursue them. Looting was a priority. Missionaries were not. At the Presidio, Captain Diego Ortiz Parilla tried to send reinforcements, but the moment his soldiers left the gates, they were ambushed and forced to retreat. The Comanche never even attacked the Presidio itself. They didn't need to. The mission had been destroyed, their message made clear. They held the power here, not the Spanish. 2 days later, just as swiftly as they had appeared, the Comanche vanished into the plains. The massacre at San Saba was a humiliation the Spanish could not ignore. Determined to reclaim their dominance, they launched a punitive expedition in 1759, led by Diego Ortiz Parilla, with one goal: retaliation against the Comanche. But from the very start, the campaign was doomed. As they moved north, they found no Comanche to fight. Frustrated, they took their anger out on the Tonkawa, slaughtering them for no reason other than that they were there. It was a sign of desperation, not strength. But the real fight was still ahead. In October, they finally encountered the Comanche at the Red River, and that's when they realized they had walked straight into a nightmare. No one entered Comanche land without them knowing. No one found the Comanche unless the Comanche wanted to be found. The Spanish had brought 1,000 men, but when they looked out across the plains, they saw a force at least twice their size surrounding them. The sheer numbers alone struck fear into their ranks, but the real panic began within. Among the Spanish force were 130 Apache and other native auxiliaries. They knew what was coming. They knew the Comanche like no one else, and they wanted no part of this fight. The moment the battle began, many turned and ran. Perea tried to hold the line, but panic spread like wildfire. What was meant to be a show of power became a chaotic retreat before the battle had even begun. The Spanish fled so fast they abandoned their cannons and supplies, leaving them for the Comanche to take as trophies. What should have been an act of vengeance ended in total humiliation. Worse yet, Apache hopes of using the Spanish as a shield against the Comanche were shattered. The message was clear. Not even the Empire of Spain could stand against the Comanche. In just a few years, the Comanche pushed farther south, turning the Spanish borderlands into their hunting ground. Spanish settlements, stretched thin across the arid landscape, became easy prey. To the Comanche, these sparsely defended outposts were nothing more than a highway of opportunity. They struck at will, choosing their targets carefully and vanishing before any meaningful response could come. The Spanish forts were the only structures that posed a real threat, but they were easy to avoid. The Comanche never attacked fortified positions. They didn't need to. As S.C. Gwynn writes in Empire of the Summer Moon, they relished surprise, insisted on tactical advantage. They would attack whole villages and burn them, torturing and killing their inhabitants, leaving young women with their entrails carved out. Men burned alive. They skewered infants and took young boys and girls as captives. With the stolen Spanish Mustangs, they could escape with unmatched speed, leaving the heavily armored Spanish dragoons lumbering behind, unable to catch them. The Comanche didn't just raid, they shattered the illusion of Spanish control over the frontier. The Spanish, like the Apache before them, struggled even to find their enemy. Every punitive expedition they launched ended in failure. Some returned empty-handed, having found nothing but endless plains. Others never returned at all. Whether they were cut down by Comanche warriors or swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape, history will never know. The Spanish had run out of options. The disaster at San Saba had left them vulnerable, and now the Apache had resumed their raids, striking Spanish settlements across the borderlands. But this wasn't about vengeance, it was about survival. Driven off the plains by the Comanche, the Apache could no longer farm or sustain themselves. They needed supplies, and the Spanish were the easiest target. By 1780, the situation had grown desperate. Domingo Cabello, the governor of Texas, wrote from San Antonio, warning that the frontier was collapsing. There is no instant day or night when the reports of barbarities and disorders do not arrive from the ranches. Totally unprotected as we are, this can only result in the complete destruction and loss of this province. The Spanish were losing control, forced to consider a strategy they had never before entertained, a war of extermination. But they weren't strong enough to fight both the Apache and the Comanche at once. Instead, they saw an opportunity, turn their greatest enemies against each other. For decades, the Spanish had failed to even communicate with the Comanche. But that changed when Don Juan Bautista de Anza entered the picture. Unlike those before him, Anza understood how to fight on the plains. He led an expedition deep into Comancheria, using the same mounted tactics the Comanche had perfected, and caught a warband off guard near Greenhorn Peak, delivering a devastating blow. The Comanche, long unimpressed by Spanish military strength, had underestimated him. They had been careless, and they paid the price. But Anza didn't just fight, he sent a message. After his victories, he released Comanche prisoners, telling them the Comanche could have peace and trade whenever they wanted it. This wasn't just about battle, it was about shifting alliances. The Spanish, once nothing more than prey, were now forcing the Comanche to make a choice. By 1785, the Comanche had not suffered devastating losses, but they had lost enough to reconsider their position. For years, the Spanish had struggled to even negotiate with them. But in Taos, something unprecedented happened. Several Comanche bands sent representatives to meet with Don Juan Bautista de Anza, and in a remarkable diplomatic feat, Anza convinced them to let one person speak on behalf of all. At the end of the meeting, the Comanche agreed to 3 key terms. They would cease their attacks on Spanish settlements. Trade between the Comanche and the Spanish would be established. The Comanche would aid the Spanish in their war against the Apache. This was a monumental victory for Spain. Not only did it bring peace with the Comanche, but it also turned them into an ally against their oldest enemy. And the Comanche, they were more than happy to agree. The impact of this alliance became clear in January 1790, when Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a combined force of Spanish troops, Comanche warriors, and Wichita fighters against the Lipan Apache. In a brutal campaign, hundreds of Apache warriors were trapped in a canyon west of San Antonio and slaughtered. By the end of the battle, the Lipan Apache were left with fewer than 1,000 warriors. With their forces shattered, Apache bands abandoned the last of their territories near Comancheria and retreated into the mountains for good. The Comanche had achieved what they had long fought for: total dominance of the plains. For the Spanish, this meant a temporary reprieve from Apache raids and a newfound peace with the Comanche, a peace that would last for decades. But the Apache were not gone. They had lost the battle for the open plains, but in the rugged mountains, where horses were no longer an advantage, they would continue to fight. Over time, the Spanish and even the mighty Comanche would fade from power. But the Apache, they would endure.